The archives contained records that redefined Jonah's understanding of human history. Deep in the facility's lower levels, behind security measures that belonged in a science fiction thriller, lay a collection of artifacts and data that painted a picture of recurring cosmic conflict spanning thousands of years. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwood, the project's senior archaeologist, guided him through collections that officially didn't exist. Stone tablets from Mesopotamia that described star demons and solar prisons. Egyptian papyri that recorded detailed observations of unusual solar activity coinciding with periods of social collapse. Mayan codices that predicted cyclic return of the hunger from the sky. Every major ancient civilization has records of this, Blackwood explained, her voice echoing in the climate-controlled vault. Not metaphorical descriptions, detailed technical documentation of solar anomalies and their effects on human consciousness. Jonah examined a Sumerian tablet that described stellar engineering projects with terminology that matched the transmission protocols almost exactly. They knew about stellar manipulation 4,000 years ago. They knew about it because they'd done it before. Look at this. Blackwood led him to a display case containing what appeared to be metallic fragments covered in intricate mathematical inscriptions. These were recovered from an archaeological site in Turkey that dates to roughly 3000 BCE. The mathematical principles described on these fragments include calculations for stellar magnetic field manipulation that we only developed in the past 50 years. Ancient astronaut theories. Something more complex. The inscription suggests that some humans were taught these technologies by previous civilizations. Not aliens, but earlier versions of humanity that had developed advanced technological capabilities before cyclic catastrophes forced them to rebuild from scratch. The implications were staggering. Human civilization might not be a linear progression from primitive to advanced, but a recurring cycle where each iteration faced the same fundamental threat and either succeeded or failed in containing it. How many cycles? Unknown. The records we've found reference at least 3 previous civilizations that achieved technological advancement sufficient for stellar engineering. They describe what appears to be a pattern. The entity gradually breaks free from containment, influences developing civilizations to weaken their own defenses, then breaks fully free and consumes the civilization before being recontained by survivors who use the accumulated knowledge to rebuild the prison. Blackwood activated a holographic display showing a timeline that stretched back 10,000 years. The pattern suggests that each cycle lasts roughly 2,500 to 3,000 years. Enough time for a civilization to develop from primitive to advanced, face the entity's influence, and either successfully contain it or be destroyed in the attempt. Where are we in the current cycle? Based on the technological markers, we appear to be near the end. Advanced enough to pose a potential threat to the entity, but not yet experienced enough to recognize its deception tactics. Jonah studied the timeline, noting patterns that aligned disturbingly with current events. The previous civilizations. What happened to them? Mixed outcomes. Some appear to have successfully recontained the entity at great cost, rebuilding civilization from small surviving populations. Others. Blackwood paused, highlighting sections of the timeline marked in red. Complete civilizational collapse. Archaeological evidence suggests periods where human population dropped to near extinction levels, followed by technological dark ages lasting centuries. And each time, the survivors left records for the next civilization. Exactly. The knowledge has been preserved in multiple forms: stone tablets, astronomical alignments, mathematical principles embedded in mythology and religious texts. The information was hidden in ways that would be discovered only when humanity reached sufficient technological development to need it. Jonah felt the weight of accumulated human experience settling on his shoulders. He wasn't just translating ancient messages. He was accessing a library of warnings compiled across millennia by civilizations that had faced the same existential threat. What can you tell me about successful containment methods? Blackwood led him to another section of the archives containing technical diagrams that looked like blueprints for impossible engineering projects. The successful approaches all involved manipulation of stellar quantum fields using coordinated electromagnetic pulses generated from multiple points around the solar system. The technology required is beyond our current capabilities, but the mathematical principles are sound. How far beyond our capabilities? Decades, normally. But the previous civilizations developed the necessary technology rapidly when faced with imminent threat. Survival pressure can accelerate technological development remarkably. What about the psychological aspects? The entity's ability to influence human consciousness. Blackwood's expression grew troubled. That's where the records become most disturbing. The entity's influence appears to grow stronger as containment weakens. In the final stages before breakthrough, it can directly control human minds across vast distances, turning entire populations into unknowing collaborators in their own destruction. She showed him inscriptions that described mass psychological manipulation events. Entire cities whose populations simultaneously began working on projects that weakened solar containment. Skilled craftsmen who unknowingly build devices that amplify the entity's mental influence. Scholars who translated false information and spread it as authentic warnings. How do we know we're not being influenced right now? We don't. But the record suggests that awareness of the influence provides some protection. Minds that understand the entity's capabilities can develop resistance to its manipulation. That's probably why the genuine warning systems were designed to activate only when civilizations reach sufficient psychological sophistication to comprehend the threat. Jonah absorbed the implications. The entire project, his recruitment, the translation work, the growing awareness of the entity's deception, might itself be part of a larger plan left by previous civilizations. Not just warnings, but an activation sequence designed to trigger when humanity reached the critical point in the cycle. Dr. Blackwood, I need to see everything. Every record, every analysis, every technical specification left by the previous civilizations. If we're going to break this cycle, we need to understand not just what threatens us, but how others succeeded in fighting it. That will take time. The records are extensive, and much of the technical information is encoded in mathematical principles that require specialized analysis. How much time do we have? Blackwood consulted her displays, cross-referencing current solar activity with historical patterns. Based on the progression of containment degradation, somewhere between 3 months and 1 year before the entity achieves sufficient freedom to begin large-scale psychological manipulation. And after that, the number of humans capable of resisting its influence drops dramatically. We'll be fighting not just the entity, but potentially millions of our own people who have been turned into unwilling agents. The scope of the threat was almost incomprehensible. But as Jonah looked around the archives, at the accumulated knowledge of civilizations that had faced the same impossible challenge, he felt a spark of hope. Humanity wasn't facing this threat for the first time. They had guidance from those who had come before, warnings from those who had failed, and blueprints from those who had succeeded. The question was whether they could learn fast enough to avoid repeating the tragedies of the past. The war room had expanded to accommodate representatives from 12 countries, though officially the meeting didn't exist. Jonah sat at a curved table that could have hosted a small United Nations session, surrounded by the kind of people who normally appeared only in classified briefings and conspiracy theories. Director Chun called the session to order with the gravity of someone announcing the end of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, we have confirmed that multiple national space agencies are proceeding with stellar engineering projects based on the false protocols. Launch dates have been accelerated, and diplomatic efforts to delay implementation have been unsuccessful. The main display showed a global map with launch sites, projected trajectories, and countdown timers. China's probe would launch in 72 hours. The European project followed 6 days later. Russia's magnetic field manipulation satellites were already in position and would begin operations within 2 weeks. Dr. Rodriguez, what's our current assessment of solar containment integrity? The astrophysicist activated a series of displays showing solar magnetic field data. Containment degradation is accelerating. The entity appears to be actively destabilizing the quantum barriers in anticipation of the false protocol implementations. Current containment effectiveness is estimated at 68% and declining. At what point does containment failure become critical? Unknown, but our model suggests that anything below 40% effectiveness would allow significant expansion of the entity's consciousness influencing capabilities. Below 20%, Rodriguez paused. Below 20%, we're looking at potential complete containment failure. A Russian representative, identified only as Colonel Volkov, leaned forward. Has anyone considered the possibility that our analysis is incorrect? That the protocols genuinely are containment measures, and our resistance is actually helping the entity escape? It was the question that haunted Jonah's thoughts during sleepless nights. The deception was so sophisticated that second-guessing became a form of psychological torture. How could they be certain they weren't being manipulated into preventing their own salvation? Dr. Kim, the psychiatrist, responded. We've been monitoring psychiatric facilities globally. The pattern of psychological intrusions is consistent with an entity that wants the protocols implemented. Patients who initially resisted the solar messages are now advocating for rapid implementation of stellar engineering projects. Their mental profiles suggest direct consciousness manipulation, including Dr. Henley, especially Dr. Henley. His condition has deteriorated significantly. He now claims that resistance to the protocols will doom humanity, and his technical knowledge allows him to create sophisticated arguments supporting immediate implementation. Shin turned to Jonah. Dr. Velasquez, you've had the most direct exposure to the entity's communication methods. What's your assessment of our current situation? Jonah had spent the previous week reviewing every piece of evidence, every translation, every analysis. The conclusion he'd reached was terrifying in its simplicity. We're being tested, he said. This entire situation, the false protocols, the accelerated launch schedules, the resistance they're generating, is a test of humanity's ability to recognize and resist sophisticated deception. The entity isn't just trying to escape its prison. It's evaluating whether our civilization is advanced enough to deserve survival. The room fell silent. The implication was clear. If humanity failed the test by implementing the false protocols, they would face destruction. But if they passed by recognizing the deception, they might earn the right to exist alongside a cosmic entity of unimaginable power. That's a hell of a gamble, muttered a European Union representative. It's not a gamble, Jonah replied. It's an inevitability. The entity has been imprisoned for millennia, but it's not powerless. It could have escaped already if brute force were sufficient. Instead, it's been preparing, learning, waiting for a civilization that might be worthy of coexistence rather than consumption. Colonel Volkov looked skeptical. You're suggesting this entity has moral standards. I'm suggesting it has survival instincts. A cosmic predator that consumes entire civilizations would eventually run out of food. But a cosmic entity that can coexist with advanced civilizations could survive indefinitely. The question is whether humanity can demonstrate the psychological and technological sophistication necessary for that coexistence. Shin activated displays showing the countdown timers. Regardless of the entity's motivations, we have less than 3 days to prevent the first false protocol implementation. Our options are limited. The discussion that followed was equal parts strategy session and moral philosophy debate. Military representatives suggested physically destroying the launch facilities. Diplomats argued for expanded international negotiations. Scientists proposed alternative stellar engineering projects based on the genuine protocols extracted from ancient records. But every option carried catastrophic risks. Military action could trigger international conflicts that would detract from the larger threat. Diplomatic delays might simply postpone the inevitable. And implementing genuine protocols required technological capabilities that humanity didn't possess. As the hours passed, Jonah found himself focusing not on what they could do, but on what they could learn. The ancient records suggested that successful civilizations had developed rapid technological advancement under pressure. But they had also demonstrated something else: the ability to make collective decisions based on incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. We need to make a choice, he said during a break in the discussion. Not just as scientists or government representatives, but as a species. Are we going to trust our own analysis and risk everything on the belief that we've correctly identified a cosmic deception? Or are we going to doubt ourselves and potentially collaborate in our own destruction? Chen looked around the table at faces that reflected the weight of the decision they faced, all in favor of proceeding with countermeasures to prevent false protocol implementation. The vote was unanimous. But Jonah could see the uncertainty in every face. They were betting the future of human civilization on their ability to distinguish between authentic warnings and sophisticated lies. As the meeting adjourned and representatives returned to their respective countries to coordinate what might be humanity's last desperate gamble, Jonah realized that the real test wasn't whether they could stop the false protocols. The real test was whether they could maintain their humanity while fighting something that existed beyond human comprehension. At 14:32 Greenwich Mean Time on a cloudless Thursday in October, the Tianlong 7 rocket lifted off from the Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center, carrying humanity's first attempt at stellar engineering, and potentially its last mistake. Jonah watched the launch from the Department of Advanced Research facility, surrounded by screens showing telemetry data that might as well have been a countdown to extinction. The Chinese probe, officially designated as a Solar Observation and Magnetic Field Analysis Platform, carried instruments designed to implement the first stage of the false protocols. If their analysis was correct, the probe would begin weakening the quantum barriers that kept the Devourer imprisoned. If they were wrong, it would begin strengthening humanity's only protection against cosmic annihilation. Transit time to operational position is 72 hours, announced Dr. Rodriguez, her voice tight with controlled anxiety. The probe will achieve solar synchronous orbit and begin magnetic field manipulation procedures on Sunday morning. Chen stood before a wall of displays showing global monitoring data. Status of countermeasures. Mixed, replied Colonel Harrison, the American military liaison. We've successfully delayed the European launch by 18 hours using diplomatic pressure. The Russian satellites have been experiencing mysterious technical difficulties that may postpone their activation. But the Chinese probe is beyond our reach. Jonah studied the probe's trajectory, calculated against the mathematical principles contained in the ancient records. If the genuine protocols are accurate, we should be able to detect containment changes within hours of the probe beginning operations. And if we detect weakening, then we'll have confirmed that the protocols are indeed false, and we'll have less than 48 hours to prevent the European launch. The next 3 days passed in a blur of anxious monitoring and frantic preparation. Sleep became impossible as teams worked around the clock to track solar magnetic field fluctuations, monitor psychiatric facilities for signs of increased mental intrusion, and prepare contingency plans for scenarios ranging from diplomatic crisis to global panic. Sunday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. The Chinese probe activated its stellar engineering protocols at 8:15 Greenwich Mean Time, beginning what its operators believed was a crucial effort to strengthen solar containment. The initial telemetry looked exactly as predicted, magnetic field adjustments that matched the technical specifications from the transmissions. For 6 hours, nothing seemed to change. Solar activity remained within normal parameters. Psychiatric facilities reported no unusual incidents. The probe's instruments showed the expected responses to its magnetic field manipulations. Then Dr. Kim burst into the monitoring center with a tablet full of urgent reports. We're seeing massive increases in psychiatric admissions across 3 continents, she announced. Patients presenting with identical symptoms, auditory hallucinations, compulsive behavior focused on solar observation, and complex technical delusions about stellar engineering. The timing was unmistakable. Within hours of the probe's activation, human minds across the globe were being invaded by an influence that grew stronger as solar containment weakened. Dr. Rodriguez, solar magnetic field status. Rodriguez checked her instruments with shaking hands. Quantum barrier efficiency is down to 58% and declining. The probe's operations are definitely weakening containment, not strengthening it. The confirmation hit the room like a physical blow. They had been right about the deception, but being right offered no satisfaction when it confirmed that humanity was actively collaborating in its own potential destruction. Chen activated emergency communication protocols. All stations, this is control. Implement code red procedures immediately. Priority override authority is now in effect. Around the world, the hidden network of facilities that officially didn't exist began coordinating humanity's most desperate gambit. Military assets moved into position around launch sites. Diplomatic channels that operated beyond normal government oversight activated emergency procedures. Intelligence services that specialized in impossible threats began implementing contingencies that had never been tested. The European Space Agency received an emergency directive from the highest levels of the European Union: postpone the launch indefinitely due to newly discovered technical concerns. When project managers demanded clarification, they were told that information was classified beyond their clearance level and that compliance was not optional. Similar messages reached the Russian space program, backed by authority that transcended normal bureaucratic channels. Launch schedules that had been accelerated for weeks were suddenly put on indefinite hold. But stopping future launches was only part of the solution. The Chinese probe was already weakening solar containment, and it would continue its programmed operations for months unless something stopped it. Options for probe deactivation. Chen asked. Colonel Harrison consulted classified technical manuals. We have 3 possibilities. Electromagnetic pulse from a military satellite could disable its systems. Physical interception, using an existing space asset, could destroy it outright. Or we could attempt to hack its control systems and reprogram its operations. Risks and timelines. All options carry significant diplomatic consequences. The Chinese government believes they're implementing crucial planetary defense measures. Destroying their probe without explanation could trigger international incidents, ranging from formal protests to military retaliation. Jonah looked up from the ancient records he'd been consulting. There might be another option. The genuine protocols include emergency containment procedures, ways to rapidly strengthen quantum barriers using existing solar phenomena. Explain. Natural solar flares create temporary electromagnetic effects that reinforce containment. The ancient civilizations learned to predict and amplify these events using relatively simple technology. If we could trigger a controlled solar flare. Rodriguez looked skeptical. Dr. Velasquez, artificially triggering solar flares is far beyond our current technological capabilities. Not trigger, Jonah corrected. Amplify. There's a natural coronal mass ejection building in the sun's northeastern quadrant. Our probes detected the preliminary magnetic instabilities yesterday. The ancient protocols describe methods for using focused electromagnetic pulses to amplify natural solar events. Using what focused electromagnetic pulses? Jonah smiled grimly. Using the Chinese probe itself. If we can reprogram its magnetic field generators to operate according to the genuine protocols instead of the false ones, it could amplify the coming solar flare enough to significantly strengthen containment. The plan was audacious, technically complex, and diplomatically catastrophic. It required hacking a foreign government space asset, reprogramming its systems based on mathematical principles derived from ancient civilizations, and gambling that a controlled solar flare wouldn't cause more damage than the entity they were trying to contain. But it was the only option that didn't require destroying the probe or allowing it to continue weakening humanity's defenses. Chen looked around the room at faces that reflected the weight of the decision. Dr. Velasquez, how confident are you in the mathematical principles from the ancient records? Confident enough to bet my life on them. The question is whether we're all confident enough to bet the future of human civilization. The silence that followed was broken by the soft chime of an incoming priority message. Chen's expression darkened as she read the communication. The Chinese probe has just begun phase 2 of its programming. Containment efficiency is now down to 52%. We have less than 12 hours before the degradation becomes irreversible. The countdown had begun again, but this time they weren't just racing against launch schedules. They were racing against the awakening of something that had been waiting in the heart of their sun for millennia, growing stronger with each passing hour, preparing for a feast that would consume not just Earth, but every world within reach of its ancient hunger. 6 months later, Dr. Jonah Velasquez stood in his Columbia University office, staring out at New York City that existed in blissful ignorance of how close it had come to annihilation. The official story, carefully crafted by multiple governments, described a successful international solar monitoring project that had detected and prevented a potentially catastrophic solar flare. The truth was both simpler and more complex. The desperate reprogramming of the Chinese probe had worked, barely. The amplified solar flare had strengthened containment barriers enough to force the devourer back into dormancy, but not enough to completely reverse the damage. Solar containment efficiency had stabilized at 73%, significantly weaker than before, but sufficient to maintain the entity's imprisonment for the foreseeable future. The psychiatric patients around the world had recovered as the entity's influence waned, though most retained fragmentary memories of their experiences. Dr. Henley had been quietly released from the London facility, his official medical records indicating a complete recovery from a rare form of solar radiation-induced psychosis. The Department of Advanced Research had returned to its shadow existence, monitoring solar activity and maintaining the network of ancient warning systems that had been activated around the globe. Similar organizations in other countries continued their vigilant watch, aware that containment might hold for decades or might begin failing again tomorrow. But the most significant change was in the small group of people who knew the truth. Jonah had returned to his academic position, but his research had shifted focus. Instead of studying dead languages, he was now part of a global effort to decode and preserve the technological knowledge left by previous civilizations. The ancient records contained far more than stellar engineering protocols. They held the accumulated wisdom of multiple cycles of human advancement, technological marvels that could accelerate humanity's development by centuries. The question that haunted him, and the others who shared the secret, was what to do with that knowledge. Chun had offered him a permanent position with the department, leading a team dedicated to preparing humanity for the next cycle of the entity's awakening. The work would involve developing technologies that could maintain stronger containment, creating education systems that could help future generations recognize cosmic deceptions, and establishing safeguards to prevent the kind of near-catastrophe they had narrowly avoided. But accepting the position meant accepting a fundamental change in the nature of human civilization. It meant creating a secret class of guardians who would preserve crucial knowledge while keeping the majority of humanity in protective ignorance. It meant making decisions about species survival based on information that most people could never be allowed to know. The alternative was disclosure, revealing the truth about the entity, the cycles of rise and fall that had shaped human history, and the precarious nature of Earth's relationship with its sun. It would mean transforming human civilization to face a cosmic threat that operated on timescales measured in millennia, preparing for conflicts that might not come for generations. Either choice carried profound moral implications. Secrecy protected people from psychological trauma, but denied them the right to make informed decisions about their own future. Disclosure would empower humanity with crucial knowledge, but might also trigger social collapse, religious upheaval, and psychological breakdown on a global scale. Jonah's phone buzzed with a message from Chun. Decision needed by tomorrow. The ancient sites are showing increased activity again. We may have less time than we thought. He walked to his window and looked up at the afternoon sky, where the sun shone with deceptive benevolence. Somewhere in that nuclear furnace, an entity older than human civilization waited with patient hunger, testing its prison and planning for eventual freedom. The choice he made in the next 24 hours wouldn't just determine his own future. It would help shape humanity's response to the greatest challenge any species had ever faced. The question wasn't whether humanity could handle the truth about what lived in their sun. The question was whether they could handle the responsibility that came with that truth. As evening fell over the city, Jonah began drafting two very different letters. One accepting Chin's offer to join humanity's secret guardians. One declining and requesting permission to begin the careful process of preparing the world for disclosure. Tomorrow, he would choose between saving humanity through secrecy or empowering them through truth. But tonight, he would sleep under stars that might witness the dawn of humanity's greatest challenge, or the beginning of its evolution into something capable of standing among the cosmic forces that shaped the universe itself. The solar prison held, for now. But prisons, even cosmic ones, were never built to last forever. And in the deepest archives of the Department of Advanced Research, translation protocols waited for the next set of transmissions. Messages that might come in years, decades, or centuries, carrying new warnings, new deceptions, or new opportunities for a species that had proven itself capable of recognizing the difference between ancient wisdom and cosmic lies. The sun would rise again tomorrow, as it had for billions of years. But for the first time in human history, some people would greet that sunrise knowing exactly what it contained and exactly what that knowledge demanded of them. The real test was just beginning.